Hello, everyone, and welcome to the sixth episode of our Lakes Chat Summer Series. I'm Jennifer Caddick, Vice President of Communications and Engagement here at the Alliance for the Great Lakes. Today, we are talking about ships, invasive species, and the Great Lakes. So researchers estimate that more than 180 aquatic invasive species like zebra mussels and the round goby have been introduced into the Great Lakes, and the majority of those were brought in as aquatic hitchhikers on board ships. These harmful critters wreak havoc on the ecosystem and cost the Great Lakes region more than $200 million in economic damage each year. Our guest today is Molly Flanagan, Alliance for the Great Lakes Chief Operating Officer and Vice President for Programs. She's going to help us understand the connections between ships and aquatic invasive species in the Great Lakes and what's being done to fix this problem. Welcome, Molly. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks for having me. And hi, everyone.
So, Molly, let's start off with some background. Tell us a bit about aquatic invasive species in the Great Lakes and why they're such a problem.
Sure. So aquatic invasive species tend to be small, but they're a really big problem for the Great Lakes. You named two great examples, zebra mussels, round goby. Also, a lot of folks have heard maybe of sea lamprey, which are vampire fish that actually attach to other fish and suck the life out of them. They cause a lot of problems in the lakes in terms of disrupting food webs or clogging water intakes. Zebra mussels are a great example of this. So if anyone's been to Lake Michigan lately, you may notice that Lake Michigan is very clear. And most people think really clear water is really clean water. That's not actually the case. Zebra mussels are sucking and filtering so much of the small base of the food web out of the water that it makes the water look clear. The problem is then there isn't enough food left for other fish. And so we're having a lake where the food web is really disrupted. We've got tons of zebra and quagga mussels, but we're losing the native fish that we'd really prefer to have in the lake.
And I know that aquatic invasive species are also a threat to like the boating industry and so on. And so we're seeing a variety of costs, right? There's these economic damages, but it's also impacting, as you said, the costs to maintain our water systems, threatens the boating industry and so on. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. And in the Great Lakes region, many of our community and states' economies get a lot of money from tourism, from boating, from fishing. The Great Lakes support a $7 billion fishery and a $16 billion recreational boating industry. So you can see how with those really big numbers that these really little critters can eat a lot of that away. And so it's something that we have to deal with, not just because we care about the environment, but because we care about our local economy.
Sure. Yeah. It's a double whammy. So what are some of the ways that these invasive species have been introduced into the lakes?
So you mentioned the main one, and that is through ballast water from ships coming in from other parts of the world. They can also get into the lakes by in the like pet trade or other types of trade where sometimes people don't know what they're buying, and then if they decide, I'm going to release my fish because I don't want to hang out with them anymore. You can get invasive species in the lakes. Generally, they don't establish populations that way, though. The way that they have often established populations is they get introduced by vessels, and then there's enough of them to be able to multiply and move throughout the lake system.
Yeah, and so that's, if I know the numbers correctly, it's something like out of those 180 aquatic invasive species I mentioned, it was something like over 60% came from ships. Like researchers have specifically been able to identify that, that's exactly how they came in, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a really big deal. And it's one of the reasons that the Alliance for the Great Lakes has focused so much energy on regulating ballast water.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about ships, because I think to understand all this, we need to understand how ships work. And so how they're brought in on ship ballast tanks. Tell us what a ballast tank is and how that works and why that's important for just a ship to operate.
Sure. So think about it like a bathtub. And if you put an empty cup in the bathtub, it sort of falls over. But if you put a cup full of water in the bathtub, then it weighs down and it's more steady. And the same thing is true for vessels. If they're sitting low in the water, then they're much more steady than if they're sitting on top of the water. And so when vessels are full with cargo, they don't need as much ballast water. But when they don't have a lot of cargo, they need ballast water to basically weigh them down into the lakes. And so if a vessel picks up ballast water in some other part of the world and then comes to the Great Lakes, loads up cargo, they have to release the ballast water so they're not too heavy. So as they're releasing that ballast water, it's not just water that's coming out, it's anything that they pulled up into those tanks when they pulled up ballast water.
Yeah, so sucking in anything that's in that port and carrying it along with them, the hitchhiker idea, to the Great Lakes. And I know our colleague Michelle, who's on the back end, can put in the link to an interactive shipping map that shows. I think a lot of times those of us in the Midwest forget that the Great Lakes are connected to the ocean through the St. Lawrence River and the St. Lawrence Seaway. So that's sort of a main, once those ships coming back and forth, you could easily see how that might happen.
Absolutely.
And so we've just talked about a bit about ocean-going ships, ships that are going across the sea to another port, picking up cargo or dropping off cargo and coming back, and they're bringing in species from far away ports. But I know there's also another group of ships in the Great Lakes region called Lakers that only travel in the Great Lakes. Like, they don't ever go out to the ocean. And so you would think like, oh, then that's not a problem. But they do play a role in this process, don't they?
They absolutely do. So Lakers, as you just explained, don't leave the Great Lakes, but they do transport a lot of cargo from port to port within the Great Lakes. And similar to ocean-going vessels, or salties, as we often call them, Lakers are also picking up and discharging ballast water. And so if you have a Laker that's taking on ballast water in one of the lower lakes, like Lake Erie or Lake Ontario, and then going up to Lake Superior, when they discharge that water as they're taking on cargo, similarly, they're not just discharging water, they're also discharging anything else that they picked up in Lake Erie or Lake Ontario. And so even though the Lakers aren't leaving the basin and they're not bringing new invasive species into the Great Lakes, they can play a significant role in moving those invasive species around. So it might be really hard for something like a zebra mussel or some other, smaller organism to make its way from Lake Erie to Lake Superior. But if it gets sucked up, a lot of it gets sucked up in even one vessel and then dumped in Lake Superior. If Lake Superior is a suitable habitat, you can see how suddenly you have an established population that could happen in Lake Superior.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I always forget about is you think about these ships going to all different ports, but they really, especially if you look at that interactive map, they're just going from the same place back and forth, kind of like a train or something. They go from one end to the other and back. And so you could imagine how over and over and over again, they're picking up the same critters and dumping them in the lakes and then going back and vice versa.
That's absolutely right. And similar to studies that have shown that salties bring invasive species into the Great Lakes, there are studies that show exactly what I just explained, that Lakers pick up ballast water in one lake, and then when they dump that ballast water, there can be species in that ballast water that have never been found in the other lake.
Yeah. So this sounds like a major problem. It is a major problem. And I know there have been efforts underway for decades now, since the 1980s. So in the 1980s, that's when zebra mussels were first documented in the Great Lakes. Researchers and advocates began ringing the alarm bell once the link was established between those ship ballast tanks and these invasive species like zebra mussels. And there was sort of a deep concern about this problem and trying to figure out how to clean up those ship ballast tanks and put some regulations in place to make sure that those shipping companies were being protective of the lakes when they were going back and forth. Mm-hmm. And I think at one point, the rate of introduction was so high that researchers said that on average, one new aquatic invasive species was being introduced every 6 months, which is just astonishing. So tell us a little bit about what efforts are being done underway to clean up those ship ballast tanks and stop those harmful critters from getting into the lakes.
Sure. So one of the things that we've been working on at the Alliance is making sure that all of those ships, whether they're coming from other parts of the country, of the world, or whether they're just moving around within the Great Lakes, have ballast water treatment on board. What that means is, think about a wastewater treatment plant. You send, a whole bunch of waste from your household to the wastewater treatment plant. That water gets treated before it gets discharged somewhere. We want the same thing to be happening with ballast water. We want there to be systems that when ships pull up the ballast water, that ballast water is getting treated before it's getting released somewhere else. And so we've long been advocating that all of the vessels need to be regulated, and legislation passed a couple of years ago that does require treatment for vessels coming in from outside of the Great Lakes region. But it left it up to EPA how to handle certain classes of vessels. And in rules that were proposed late last year, it was proposed that those lakers, those ships that only travel around the Great Lakes, that they are exempted, which we've just described how lakers can move invasive species around the Great Lakes. Why would we exempt them from regulations?
Yeah, I think that's a critical question for sure. And so we'll talk about that in a second. To go back, there's also a lot of coordination between the United States and Canada, right? Like we have to remember this is a binational waterway. And so there are ports in the US and ports in Canada. And actually when you come in through the St. Lawrence River, you're coming through Canada first. So how does all of that work? How do the two countries work together?
Yeah, so one of the things that both countries do require is for those salties to actually do ballast water exchange. And that's exactly what it sounds like. When they're still out in the ocean, where there's highly concentrated salt water, vessels have to pull up that water and basically mix it with any ballast water or any other materials that are in the ballast tank, and then swish it, like spit it out, basically. And so what that does is if they were at a freshwater port, the hope is when they pull up that salt water that it's killing anything that might have been in there. So then when they come into the Great Lakes and they're releasing that ballast water, there's less likely to be invasive species in that ballast water. And that's really pulled down the rate of introduction of invasive species, but it hasn't eliminated it. And so that's where we get into ballast water treatment. And Canada just last month, just this month, very recently, released their final regulations of ballast water. And I think the thing that we are most excited about is that Canada is regulating salties and lakers. So they're doing exactly what we've been asking the governments to do, which is to make sure that any vessels operating in the Great Lakes have ballast water treatment on board. They're giving lakers a longer time frame to get that treatment on board, but they're still required to get it done. And there are ballast water treatment systems available that saltwater vessels have already started to put on their vessels. So we know they can do it, and we know they can meet those deadlines. For lakers, there's potentially a little bit more work to do to tweak some of those technologies to make sure they work for the constraints of those ships. And so Canada's giving them a little bit more time to work out the kinks and make sure that they can also treat ballast water. Props to Canada on this one.
Yeah, great job. Kudos Canada for keeping an eye on the Great Lakes. So like what happens now? I know that you and at the Alliance and other groups have been calling on, now that Canada has these new rules that include regulating lakers in addition to those salties. I know there's a push underway to encourage the Biden administration to go back and re-examine their rules on all this. What happens? What's that process look like?
Absolutely. So when the Biden administration came in, they put a freeze on all rulemaking. So anything that hadn't been finalized was frozen until the administration has a chance to review those and decide whether to let them continue forward through the process or whether they want to revisit it and potentially make changes to those rules. And the ballast water regulations are one of those that we are hoping, as they're pausing to take a look at rules, that they'll take a look at those and decide, EPA could have done a better job with this. And if Canada can require treatment for all vessels that operate in the Great Lakes, how's our EPA going to argue that the United States can't do that? And so our hope is the administration is going to pull back those rules, spend some time making changes to them, coordinating with Canada on that, and then releasing for public comment a new draft of the rules for groups like the Alliance and for folks who might be watching to send comments into EPA.
And we'll certainly let folks know when it's time to send those letters. And I know that, Molly, I know that you and your team here at the Alliance and our partners who work on this issue around the region are going to be keeping a close eye on that regulatory process here in the U.S. So I know we have so much to talk about, but that's all the time we have for today. Huge thank you, Molly, for taking some time to chat with us today about ships, invasive species, and the Great Lakes. And big thank you to Michelle Farley, our colleague who you don't see, who is behind the scenes. She's dropped some helpful links in the chat, and she's helping to make all of this happen. So big thanks, Michelle. And so that's all we have time for today. Join us next Tuesday, July 20th at 1 p.m. Eastern, noon Central for our next Lakes Chat. We'll be talking about environmental justice with Crystal Davis, our Vice President for Policy. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.